Great, welcome everybody to the next session. So this session is entitled Training, Educational Development. And I should start by introducing the people that are going to be part of this, this panel. We're going to form a panel on the stage, but really what we hope is going to happen in this session is it will open it up into more of a group discussion about the issues. Though actually we started so brilliantly yesterday by Anna and Maria. So next slide, please. Next slide, please, as well. Great. So the six of us are all part of a fairly informal network of practitioners, really, who find ourselves with some curricular responsibilities in various HE and FE institutions in the UK, and have met informally as a group online mainly over the last 3 years, mainly through lockdown. And we were interested in this opportunity to kind of bring some of what we've been thinking about into this forum as a way of emphasising the nature of peer dialogue as a form of knowledge development. So for us, the conversations that we have as practitioners in these different roles. Oh, great, thank you. Slightly lost my train of thought. What was I saying? Peer dialogue. Relying on your friends to help you out when you kind of forget what you're meant to be saying. So our intention was to bring some of that kind of sense of dialogic energy into the proceedings. So we've been quite rigorous at limiting what we're going to talk about. So we said none of us is going to speak on the thing that we're going to say for longer than 7 minutes, to maximise the amount of time that there is for a more involved discussion that everybody can be part of. There are a number of assumptions that we kind of start from, and one of them is that before there were community music SIMM curricula, there were people who became and who still do become community musicians and socially engaged musicians. So, this is really a way of understanding how did that happen, and I think our approach is to thinking about the role of the institution are based around some of that collective understanding of collective knowledge of how we came to be in the positions that we were in, which didn't necessarily involve training in that sense, although in the nature of dialogue, I know some of my colleagues will disagree with that. But what we're suggesting is that when it comes to the institution, that really the point of transformation in a socially engaged musical encounter is that which happens between a more socially engaged musician or group of musicians and a less culturally engaged individual or group of individuals or community, and the institution therefore has a role in how that's mediated, but it's not the be all and end all of it. It's the encounter between human beings that's at the heart of it. So our starting position was therefore to question some of the terms of the premise. So the title of this thread is around training socially engaged musicians, and we kind of, some of our discussions around this started from the place of thinking that the word training doesn't necessarily fully grasp the complexity of how musicians develop their capabilities to lead socially engaged participatory processes. So each of us is going to speak for no more than 7 minutes, and then we'll have time for some questions, and then hopefully what we'll have time for is for you to have some discussions with the people near you, and then what we'd like to do is open that up into more of a general discussion. Great. So from my perspective, my journey over the last 20 years has taken me from Sage Gateshead to Kensington. At Sage Gateshead, I was responsible for undergraduate programmes, including the UK's first degree that was called Community Music. And I was at Sage Gateshead from 2010 until 2018. I'd been there previously from 2000 until 2005, during which time the organisation went through a big growth of its workforce, increased its workforce from the 8 of us that were working in socially engaged contexts at the start of the organisation in 2000 to about 140 musicians working in the learning and participation programme by about probably 2008, 2009, something like that. And that was done through an apprenticeship. It was recognising that the way that people learn to do this work until now, or have learned to do this work, is generally by being part of a community of practice, by coming across other musicians who do this kind of work and finding ways of being involved with the work, and gradually over time taking on more responsibility within those roles. So the community music degree programme was developed with some of these principles in mind, that we and these have become kind of the same things that are what I bring to the work that I do at Royal College of Music, which is firstly that this kind of work is deeply situated, that it's different in every place that you find it, because the people are different, the participants are different, and the musicians who do it are different. One of the students who was on the first year of the community music course said, "Who actually invented community music, Dave?" Because every guest speaker that you brought in to tell us about community music thinks they invented it. So who actually invented it? To which the answer was, well, everybody invented it. There wasn't a way of doing it. If you're going to do this kind of work, you had to kind of invent it. And in fact, because everybody's a unique musician, a unique individual, the practice that they develop is unique to them. So firstly, preparing to do this kind of work is a recognition that the work is deeply situated. It's always about this place, these people, these materials, these traditions, and it changes. So part of the way that people need to prepare to do this work is to recognise that it changes and each situation is different. Also, that it's for it to be done effectively, it's underpinned by an ethical responsibility, an ethic of care, an ethic of love, as in unconditional positive regard, that it's driven by empathy, that it's driven by mutuality and reciprocity. That in order to be able to do this work, you have to have some musical capabilities. There has to be something musical that you're able to lead with. You need to have some confidence and competence in music itself to be able to do the work, but also you need to have pedagogical capabilities, and the pedagogical capabilities that you develop need to be able to respond to different situations. So in that sense, they're a situational kind of pedagogy. It's a pedagogy that is able to change and respond to the different places that you might find yourself. There is no one size fits all. There is no toolkit that you can take with you and roll out in every place you go. It's also that the nature of that pedagogical approach is that it's also dialogic, in the sense of being curious about things that may not be familiar, being curious about the stranger, the other, people who do things differently to the way that you do them, who make music in a different way to the way that you do, and being willing to go visiting, in Hannah Arendt's sense, being willing to kind of see what happens when you go visiting other people's ways of being musical, and that it's praxial in the sense of it has to start from a place of being practice based, but it is also deeply bound up in reflection. So in order to do this work effectively, there need to be opportunities for you to reflect on what you do with other people. And then, perhaps most importantly, I think, that there need to be ways of engaging with it that are authentic. And I'll tell you what I mean by authentic. In the sense that the practice is always situated in that it's always this place, these people, these materials, these traditions. It's always this musician that is the other part of that equation, and that involves being self-aware and being able to be authentically relational, being able to be in relationship with people as a human being, as yourself. And if authenticity is about the way in which our self-awareness can actually function as a mediator of our agency. So understanding who we are and how we are in different situations can change the way that we think about how we go about doing things. So it means constantly having to look at yourself, to reflect, in order to feel that you can be yourself in these situations. So I'm not quite sure how much time I've had there, but I think that's probably
48 seconds.
Great. I'm going to finish there, and we're going to pass on to the next slide. Catherine Birch can't be with us, but she can be here.
In Freire's 1970 Pedagogy of the Oppressed,
The power of audio.
he asserts that education
Can we have her a
is
bit louder,
potentially
please?
transformative.
And actually,
Holding that consideration in
can we
mind
start the
enables
audio
those
again,
of us.
please?
In Freire's 1970 Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he asserts that education is potentially transformative. Holding that consideration in mind enables those of us working in higher education contexts to understand the importance of our ongoing interactions and relationships with our students, specifically those training to be socially engaged musicians. Freire's work underscores the commitment to non-discriminatory, humanising interactions. He connects collaboration and negotiation to enabling the choice and self-empowerment of individuals alongside the importance of working with, not for, our students. As a community musician who leads the bachelor's degree in community music at York St John University, UK, I want to propose a framework for considering Freire's philosophical assertions that could support those of us involved in training socially engaged musicians. Freire highlights the importance of dialogue. He suggests that dialogue characterises an epistemological relationship. Thus, in a sense, dialogue is a way of knowing and should never be viewed as a mere tactic to involve students in a particular task. What is illuminated here is the social aspect in the process of knowing. If we are to cultivate shared learning with our groups, dialogue is a way we can engage in the reciprocal process of knowing in order to break down some of the potential hierarchical, cultural, and social barriers. Through conversation, dialogue, and engaging in open and supportive discourse, we can enable a process of ongoing safety with our groups to be gradually established. Higgins 2012 additionally encapsulates those themes as connected to the notion of hospitality, emphasising the need for emphatic understanding. Empathy as a requirement of safety also helps to create trust in the learning space. Higgins connects these notions as conscious choices for community music practitioners, not abstract concepts or personality traits. We have to be intentional in our practice, including when working with our students. In 1975, Gadamer asserts that environments of trust can enable a dialogue where preconceived ideas, misunderstandings, and potential for miscommunication can be explored and highlighted. These kind of non-judgmental and open spaces for dialogue are key in modelling to students the expectations around how they can look to facilitate their own groups. Escobar 2011 asserts that trust has to be modelled before mutual trust can be developed. Understanding that we work in creative partnership, listening with respect and openness helps us model and establish trust in the space. If we are to engage in Freire's model of practice, we need to recognise the importance of collaboration. This negotiated and reciprocal approach to learning again highlights how vital engaging in conversation is. In his explorations of dialogue, Escobar states, knowledge is co-created in conversation. In dialogue, the exchange of ideas is mutually transformative and enhances understanding of selves and others. This concept of co-creation and knowledge deepening our understanding of each other can help to explain why creative collaboration can be so powerful. In collaborative approaches, a mutual understanding is reached so that the music does not belong to one person, but is a culmination of the creative discourse. Engaging students in dialogue and understanding that the creative process can therefore have transformative potential for both facilitator and participants is a vital aspect of socially engaged music practice. Freire emphasises the importance of the pursuit to be more fully human as part of the process of transformation. Enabling the self-empowerment of our students holds significance when we also understand what Freire describes as the culture of silence of the dispossessed. Students training in socially engaged music making will be working with groups where individuals will have been impacted by this culture of silence. For example, those who've experienced trauma have often been silenced, their suffering hidden from view, cutting them off from others and negatively impacting their ability to create deep interpersonal connections. As facilitators, we can support individuals in finding their voice and give space to those who've been silenced, enabling creative interactions where participants can begin to feel heard, understood and valued, as opposed to silenced, stigmatized or oppressed. Modelling this with our students is a way of helping them understand the importance of enabling the voices of those with whom they will work. Giving choice for our students is also key for their development. We need to know when to let go, when to support, and when to step back, giving space for independence. As Higgins and Shane Campbell 2010 describe, as facilitators, we need to know when to relinquish control. Freire also explores this idea, stating, libertarian action must recognise dependence as a weak point and must attempt through reflection and action to transform it into independence. Our responsibility in relinquishing control and enabling the choice of our students can also provide a greater sense of accomplishment, where individuals can feel a sense of pride in their work. Again, modelling this relinquishing of control will support students in understanding how to enable the choice of their participants in the groups they're working with. Freire states that those who authentically commit themselves to the people must re-examine themselves constantly. Reflective and reflexive practice can be tools by which we can re-examine ourselves, and as Freire suggests, reflection, true reflection, leads to action. Engaging in reflective and reflexive practice has given me pause to consider my ethical responsibility to my students. We can support students in developing their own reflective practice and therefore create a space in which both the individual and the group can flourish. Freire's pedagogy of the press offers philosophical insights that can support us as we work in training socially engaged musicians. Understanding our role as facilitators in this process, not as the driving force, nor as the insignificant bystander, can help us develop healthy boundaries of practice and to see the potential for mutual transformation in this work.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Unfortunately, also, Ceri. Oh, thank you. Ceri Tippetts, who's part of this group as well, has had a family emergency come up in the last few days, so he's unable to be with us. But I wanted to just put the slide up briefly, so you get a sense of what Ceri would have contributed to this discussion. Her title was Tensions Between Expectations and Dialogic Practice. Jess, did you talk with Ceri about this a bit as well?
Ceri and I spent a great deal of time mulling over this symposium. We have an entire Padlet dedicated to it. But she basically was talking about, and sorry, Ceri, if you watch this back and I got it wrong, about the expectations she teaches in a conservatoire that a lot of the students arrive with into the room of an expert, giving them, kind of didactically information and skilling them up, versus a more dialogical approach that includes much more give and take between whoever's facilitating their development. I think that's the bottom line.
And more generally, it might kind of open up thoughts that we can talk about later around around the kind of, you know, a culture of perfectionism generally, and what that means in terms of what, you know, practitioners from a conservatoire background undertaking to carry out this kind of work. Is it the same kind of practice when it's come from that perspective? Because obviously that increasingly more of this work is likely to be done by students who come from conservatoire backgrounds. So some of the things I hope we'll tease out in the discussion is actually, does that change the nature of the practice over time? But onwards, Graham, the floor is yours.
Hello. I'm going to try and distill 30 years of community music training, teaching, learning at Goldsmiths into now 6 minutes, 45 seconds. Sorry, I am obsessed with time. I am a drummer. Back in 1991, when community music was a barely known practice, characterized by, I suppose I'd call it positive intentions and highly informal practice, a few musicians who'd worked with the great John Stevens, incredible jazz drummer, and the writer of, I suppose for a lot of us, the Bible of community music, Search and Reflect. Musicians who'd worked with him were looking at ways forward to develop the field. And one of them, Phil Mullen, who I'm sure a lot of people in the room are aware of, came to the then Goldsmiths College looking to establish a course in music workshop skills. And this started the now 30-year history we have and experience of training, teaching, and developing community musicians. I joined the cohort in 1992, the second year, coming with no formal musical qualifications whatsoever. I've had 2 drumming lessons. I learned a paradiddle. I can't remember what I learned in the second lesson. But a lot of experience. I'd been 15 years on the road. I toured the world. I'd made innumerable records. And I came applying to Goldsmiths thinking, I'm not going to get into this college. I don't have the paper. I don't have all of this. And I improvised on a pair of bongos for 5 minutes in front of Phil to join the course, and was taken onto the course and later came to lead that course. And 30 years later, I'm a lecturer, course leader, tutor, and trainer for Goldsmiths. But it was the open and the inclusive approach to recruitment that made this program, as we now call it, special. The student cohort included classical musicians, buskers, DJs, singers, producers, rappers, improvisers, rockers, folkies, African, Iranian, Indian, Australian, Caribbean, Balkan musicians, 19-year-olds, 75-year-olds, all genders, classes and types of musician imaginable. A 2-year, 1-day-a-week program situated at level 4, the first year of a degree equivalent, allowed for peer-to-peer learning, development of reflective practice, experimentation, research, real-life work experience, including setting up projects and focusing on our own bespoke journeys to practice. In the same way that there's no single way to be a community musician, there is no single pathway to being that. And it's essential to us that the students created their own personalised and flexible route through all assessments, which did include written as well as practical elements, assessed rigorously and subject to external examination. With the introduction of student fees in 2014, the course became unsustainable. So we went to a music department who 2 years earlier had declined our programme as it would, inverted commas, dilute their brand. And we initially created one, then a second module in the third year of BA Music and Pop Music degrees. We now run music in educational, community and therapeutic contexts and music workshop skills. Over the 30 years, we've had about 300 or so graduates launched into community practice, now working in a huge breadth of contexts. A large number work as freelancers, working with excluded young people, disabled people. We have Farsi speakers working with refugees, ex-offenders with lived experience working in prisons, music therapists, numerous community interest companies set up through partnerships of ex-students working in hospitals, care homes, in lung health, even some leading major organisations, including music hubs, and others going on to take masters and PhDs. The shift from informal audition to third-year degree level has changed the nature of the trainees, and the result is a loss of diversity, but still a large body of engaged, socially committed and curious musicians, but one that looks a bit more like any other HE course. And this comes for me to the nub of it. To question the role and place of higher education as it currently stands in being able to deliver the workforce for a dynamic and still expanding field. Gatekeeping of higher education remains dependent on an outdated and imperialist grade system, a hierarchy of musical styles and skills, and is holding back the potential for a truly diverse field of socially engaged musicians, and is in serious need of restructuring. That isn't to say that the current crop aren't brilliant and won't do fantastic work, as is testified by the assessments I'm going off to mark this afternoon, which look at things like punk rock as community music, Parkinson's in music, and explorations of the lack of diversity in the exam board repertoire. I've spoken to a lot of students ahead of today, and they all testify to the experiential learning, the real-world experience, the combination of theory and practice, peer-to-peer learning, the diverse range of musics explored, and student sharing, and the 2-hour timeline. They also describe how the kite mark that does come with HE, the kite mark of Goldsmiths, helped to open their doors. The challenge for me going forward is to ensure that buskers, DJs, rappers, improvisers, folkies, people, musicians from all over the world have a place in the field, and how, above all things, musicians who don't have traditional formal music education can have their skills recognised and represented. How we can look towards thinking what a new kind of, an alternative virtuosity is, an alternative approach to musical learning and musical development, and that HE can recognise non-formal music learning as a valid and valuable equal, so that we can enable a more diverse workforce of accredited and approved quality, and essentially a workforce that looks like the people we work with. Thank you.
Hello. I just wanted to start with that because it's actually slightly representative of a typical class, perhaps, although we do a real broad mix, and I'll come back to that perhaps in a moment, because my notes now look a bit like this in response to everything I've been listening to for the last 2 days. So firstly, thank you, Dave, for including me, and SIMM for having us. I'm Jess. I'm a musician, a community music practitioner, an educator. I'm the chair of Sound Sense, which is the UK membership organisation for community musicians. And I'm a questioner of everything we do. I hope to just leave you with a couple of thoughts, maybe provocations, tensions, questions that I often carry myself in the field. I will never get through the 4 pieces of paper I have here. Briefly about the context I work in. I work in Edinburgh College, which is it was more of a vocational school. You know, you did a 2-year HND degree in music, and now we have a BA honours degree in music in association with Kingston University here in London. So it's a huge jump for the students from HND, pass or fail, into an honours degree year, which is marked and assessed within an inch of its life. That's an entire other topic we could discuss. Most of the students are Scottish. They're local. They're going to stay local. They're going to contribute back into the community in which they are already a part of. And I feel that's quite an important point. Yeah, and I'm module leader for a module called Engagement in Music Making, the Emerging Practitioner. A rather vague title because it isn't specifically focused on community music. It's about enabling other people's musicking experiences in a range of contexts, which therefore makes it a very nebulous module to teach or to train others in. I had to number things and change them around, so I think I'm going to actually make my point up front, so the rest can just be thrown away if I run out of time. My point is simply that what does it mean to train socially engaged musicians? Because actually, for me, it's about training, enabling, and encouraging social relationships and safe rapport. A lot of the young people, or I should say the students I work with, because actually last year I had a student in his late 60s. He was great, it was brilliant, we have a real range. In order to become a socially engaged musician, they first need to become socially engaged people. And I feel that a lot of the students come in not aware of what it might mean to operate in a more socially engaged way in society. Hence the quote up there from one of my students. The kind of learning and work we are doing is far more personal than other classes and requires close examination of ourselves and our character and the way we interact with each other, people, and the environment we live in. For me, that was part of a reflective essay means we've done it right. Somehow, that class has succeeded, because if that's all they walk away with is a bit of self-examination and exploring their relationship with the world, it's about as much as I can expect out of a compulsory module where a lot of students wouldn't, at least in the beginning, have chosen to be there. And if I plant the seeds of responsibility and duty of care about this practice, and they leave knowing it's not for them, that's also success. So it's that idea of what does it mean to create to ask people to be reflective? We have to teach them how to be reflective, because actually asking them to reflect, in my case, is very challenging. It's not a skill that they've honed. So we're very basic. I'm almost basic, and I've clearly thrown my script away because I'm stopping looking at it. So basically, we do something like that activity, it's a drumming workshop, and then we're going to unpick it. We're going to discuss how it felt to be a participant, because my classroom is also a participatory lab. They are participants, we are a group. So what I try so hard to create in that space is the sense of safety, the capacity to say no. I actually don't want to take part in this, but then explore why, what the tension for that student is and the discomfort. One student left the room in the drumming workshop. It was too much for him. And I went and I talked to him about it, and he said, I stayed as long as I could, and now I feel like I should go back because I want to challenge myself. And I said, well, you already did challenge yourself. You stayed. Come back if you want. But he took a reflective step. He took his own actions, his agency, but he also took a reflective, he was able to notice and reflect. For me, that's success. My biggest tension is that I have to ask my students to meet requirements, and I have to assess and mark them, which is something in my practice as a music practitioner I would never do. I do not assess or expect specific outcomes from my projects. They are very participant-led. So I'm in a situation where I'm living in the tension of asking my students to undertake things that I wouldn't necessarily ask them to do as practitioners. But I could say more, but I won't even try because I've got like 20 seconds. So in essence, my goal is to just build safe rapport and a space where they know they can be themselves and take that out into the world with them after. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. I'm Tim Palmer. I'm from Trinity-Laban. And just aside from what I intended to say, something I've just noticed, which I think is quite important for me thinking now, is the three of us on this panel who work in conservatoires, that's Dave and Ceri and myself, have used photographs of our buildings. And I've just noticed this. And the two who don't haven't. And this reminds me of Rosie Burke-Perkins' work about the way that buildings manifest and control the pedagogies of the Conservatoire sector. So I'm going to talk about institutions and the relationship between institutions and the training programs. But I just thought that was an observation worth pointing out. Okay, so I'm going to look at a case study of one Conservatoire program that I lead, and that seeks to nurture student identities that include the social impact of music making. And then I'm going to look at one aspect of the policy framework in England, so it's a bit limited, but I hope it's representative, it's resonant of the issues in the Conservatoire sector more broadly. And it impacts on how Conservatoire identities are established and communicated, and the relationship to social impact in music making. So Trinity-Laban's the Teaching Musician Programme. It's a blended learning master's. It's shortly about to become an online-only master's. I mean, we host a broad spectrum of professional educators, classroom teachers, instrumental teachers, community musicians. Actually, it's Graham's broad spectrum of potentially even buskers, if they have any kind of educative or community music practice. And this reflects a view that there are some kind of holistic central concerns that occupy music education across all contexts. And central to our teaching model is the need to reorient students away from what are typically rigid, culturally dictated dominant practices in music education. And this means that much of our teaching and assessment is focused on supporting and challenging individual students' professional practices. And we also foreground a lot of peer-to-peer interactions, and we have an extremely international community, which means that students get insight into different conceptions and contexts of music education from around the world. Now, there's three modules in particular that is just briefly worth mentioning as particularly transformative for students. The first is what we call our education placement module, where students have to go on a placement in a context with which they are professionally unfamiliar. And students use the placement as a way of understanding more about different contexts in music education and different ways of being music educators or community practitioners. We also have a learning mentor module where students engage with somebody who they identify as an inspirational character to learn from within music education. And we have another one where module where students have to collaborate with each other on running, designing, evaluating, reporting on a socially engaged project, which they have to set up. Now, students regularly cite these three modules as being the most transformative amongst the program. And the issue is really because what we're doing is we're offering them future possible selves. We're challenging their identities and making them rethink who they are and who they could be. And one of the results that we often get is that as a result of their program, we notice that many students reorient their professional practices towards SIMM contexts because they discover other ways of being. And bearing in mind, these are mid-career professionals, so we're not talking about young people here. You know, we have students up to 60 and beyond. So we're really in the business of developing individuals in both planned and unplanned ways, in predictable and unpredictable ways. And in this, in Lee Higgins' language, it's a manifestation of safety without safety. They take the course knowing it's a safe space, but actually there's an enormous risk for them in who they become as a result of their program. Right. Excuse me 1 second. Now, it's not just individuals who have fluid and multiple identities which are in flux, but I believe that institutions do so too. Because on the one hand, conservatoires enact these rigid, culturally dictated dominant practices, and on the other hand, they hold events like this. And I want to look briefly at how one policy framework acts as a brake on institutional change in the UK conservatoire sector. So this is a bit nerdy, but conservatoires in England receive a significant tranche of funding. It's typically around 20% of their overall income from a particular government strand called ISTA, which is the Institutional Specific Targeted Allocation. And it's assessed by the Office for Students. Incidentally, it's just gone through assessment just now, so it's present in anyone in conservatoire leadership's mind. Now, the criteria for ISTA are extremely specific. The criteria are that the institution has to have an international reputation, being world-leading in its specialism, and its students have to have a recognized impact on the industry for which they are trained. Okay? Now, without this money, most of the institutions in the UK would not be able to offer the kind of intensive performance training that they do, so it's essential. But this discourse of a single specialism and of specific routes into an industry is one-dimensional. To be funded, conservatoires have to mould to this frame of elite music performance within preconceived employment frameworks. And these serve and reinforce hegemonic conceptions of how musicianship works out in society. Now, this is just one policy pressure amongst many, but the trouble is that these narratives of elitism and roots into an industry, music performance industry, and the specialism is clearly kind of musical performance within the Western art tradition, mostly, although we have jazz departments and music theatre and occasionally rock and pop as well. But the narratives are supported by lots of stakeholders within the Conservatoire, entering students and some staff and so on. So there's an ambiguous and conflicted narrative here amongst institutions. Many develop great programs like the teaching musician at Trinity-Laban, but they're inhibited in promoting their multiple identities and their multiple narratives of musical excellence without damaging their reputations necessary for funding as upholders of the elite traditions in music. There's an irony here. I undertook research into virtuoso soloists with David Baker. And what we found was that those who are actually at the pinnacle of what's often regarded as the elite musical tradition generally have extremely broad conceptions of study in order to inform musical performance, and often have really embedded notions of the social impact of their careers and the things that they can do. So the elite kind of single track route doesn't necessarily represent what's necessary to get to excellence. Now, in response, I would argue that institutions like mine and this one need to present fluid and multiple identities, proud to be in flux as we learn from our students and our cultures about what musicianship might mean here and now. This is Graham's alternative virtuosity. Our very concept of musicianship needs to be troubled, noting that elite music education in places like this is frankly a rather poor education in many musical traditions or musical skills that are highly valued around the world, such as improvisation, participatory leadership. So instead, we need policy frameworks that permit risk and allow us to foreground music making as a relational and social practice, that make it safe for institutions to be unsafe in recrafting musicianship as a multi-dimensional phenomenon, and in doing so, recrafting ourselves. So as part of this, we also need to unpick the social impacts of gender, race, class, and power within our repertoires and our pedagogies, noting that social impact starts at the very moment we make sound, and it extends through every dimension of our life choices with music. If conservatoires are truly going to represent artistic leadership in the 21st century, then they need to be promoting the narrative that the specialism, if there is just one, and there isn't, but the specialism is really to position the social right at the heart of music making, and that drives excellence. We're training students not just for multiple industries, but also as opponents of the industrial, for fluid roles as musicians in society. Now, if we cannot get these policy frameworks right, those of us who are pushing for change in higher music education are likely to remain frustrated.
Great. Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Jess, and thanks, Graham, for all of those really interesting and thoughtful presentations. So I'd like to open it up. We've got quite a bit of time, actually, which is great. We've got about 50 minutes, I think. Is that about right? 45 minutes. I'd like to open it up to the floor first, just if there are any thoughts or questions that arise from anything that you've heard in the last half an hour that you might want to address to the panel. And let's start with some Q&A. Great. Deanna has a question.
Thank you so much. My name is Deanna Yarachuk. I teach at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. I coordinate a Bachelor of Music degree that specializes in community music. So this is Oh my gosh, there's so much. So I'd love to sit down with all of you for about 4,000 hours to really dig more into this. I think the one piece I want to pick up is those of you that are running programs where you are teaching musician skills as well as community music facilitation skills. So it's I'm working from a bachelor music program, so I'm working with fresh out of high school, right? Like 17, 18-year-olds into 22. And it is we're finding it extremely difficult to teach a diversity of musical practices and the critical thinking to understand how to position and contextualize those musical practices so that we're decentering, I presume Western art music is what I would say, but I think when you say conservatoire, is that we're kind of saying a similar thing, the classical music, right? So something that decenters that, but when there's no center, we run the risk in our program of being a mile wide and an inch deep. So, which I'm just put out there, that's, I think, what our program tends to do, my program tends to do, where we're introducing students to lots of different practices, lots and lots of different things, but they only get introduced, so they don't actually develop expertise by the time they graduate. So I just would invite anyone that's willing to speak to this tension around how do you work with, I'm thinking musical diversity, but also musicians coming in with diverse backgrounds, right? So how do you hold that diversity and help them kind of develop whatever their expertise is to be able to do this work well as graduates?
Graham, do you want to speak to that?
You're going to have a go too? Okay. You want to go first?
No, you go first.
I mean, I think there's a lot in that. And firstly, I think it's really, really important to come back to the idea of every community musician is different and is going to need a different skill set. You know, if I'm going to work with a group of elders experiencing dementia, then I probably need a different repertoire from if I'm going to go into a young offenders institute. But at the point of training community musicians or introducing community musicians, I think it's really important that we do give them a diverse range of musical ingredients so that they have an awareness. I mean, personally, I think it's as important for a student to be able to play around with music from the minimalist tradition as it is to understand what a drill beat is, to have both of those. But you're not going to, it's very unlikely that somebody is going to be a specialist in developing workshop materials from Steve Reich and also Central C. So I think if they've got an introduction, they can choose their own pathway. But if you haven't been exposed to all of those musics, then maybe, especially if you are an earlier career, you may not know which route you want to go down. And then it's really for the students to develop their own practice if they want to go down a particular pathway. But we've given them a taste, really, of what they might want to explore.
Yeah, I think I'll just build on that. I mean, my students have one module in their 3 years. And 2 hours a week for 30 weeks. I have 60 hours, so it's a must, should, and could in what I am offering and enabling them to experience in those few hours. So I think, just building on what Graham said, flavors, and then you pick your flavor, and you're going to delve into it further, right? I don't think we can expect them to become experts, and I think it would be wrong to put that on ourselves to make them multiple experts in musicality. But also, I think my must is around teaching them boundaries so that they don't say, yeah, I can do that workshop, when actually the duty of care to the participants in the room is to know, I actually can't do that workshop. I don't have the skills to go. I don't know enough about, we might not have lived experience that's the same, but we might have common ground, and that helps. But, I was once asked to run a workshop in a locked ward here in London for young people with eating disorders. And I thought, they're teenagers, no problem. That's who I work with. Day 2, they wouldn't sit down. And I didn't understand that there was a reason why they wouldn't sit down. And this was earlier in my career, had I spent a little bit of time getting to know some of the habits and maybe, exploring a little bit more about what to expect, which is what I would do now, and what I, really highly push my students to consider is, can you do this bit of work? Is it right for you? You could wing it. We can all wing it, but is winging it good enough? Where's the disservice? You know, so I did learn that standing uses more calories. So now I know that, you know, and I maybe will do the whole workshop standing up. So it's not an issue, you know. Question.
Hi, this is...
Great. Can I just respond to that as well? And actually, there's an interesting question coming from Liv online as well. Liv is asking the question: is it time for some form of accreditation and training pathway for community musicians outside of institutions, or what can institutions do to foster better relationships with organisations delivering the work and support an experiential training pathway for students, and who pays for this? From my experience of working at Sage Gateshead, so as I say, before we had the community music degree programme, we had community music apprenticeships. And this was because there was a recognition at the start of Sage Gateshead that in order to deliver its ambitions of being able to work meaningfully in all of the communities that it was meant to serve, that it needed to diversify its workforce. And that meant getting involved in all kinds of contexts. And that meant working with those communities to identify people from within those communities who might take on leadership roles and responsibilities within those communities. So when we started the degree, it was quite naturally full of people from a very wide range of different backgrounds. And immediately, Deanna, what happened is everybody felt like a fraud, because everybody felt that everybody, as musicians tend to do, wanted to define themselves by the things they couldn't do. So all the classical musicians thought they felt a fraud because they didn't feel like they were confident at improvising. All the rock and pop musicians felt uncomfortable because they couldn't read music, and everybody was kind of in this situation where they felt less than, they felt incompetent. So we developed one of the things that became a permanent fixture during the course was a slogan on the wall that said, "Step out of your comfort zone and come into mine." So that when people were making music together, there was an invitation to feeling competent. And that helped in lots of different ways, because actually it led to all kinds of really interesting musical ideas being developed as people worked out how to combine rapping and classical piano, or whatever that might, it might happen to be. But it also, in terms of what Jess was talking to as well, in terms of the experience that people had, that people understood that actually music making makes people feel incompetent. So, one of the biggest barriers to getting involved in a music project is you feel rubbish at it. So actually it's really important as somebody who's leading musical activities to put yourselves in situations where you can go visiting and feel incompetent even though you're really good at what you do, because that gives you more insight and more empathy in terms of other people's experiences. And the second half of Liv's question was about who pays for this. And actually, 140 musicians were trained through Sage Gateshead, and that was all paid for through, is it the ESF, the European Social Fund money? Some people may remember that funding from like about 2000 through till about 2008, which paid for an awful lot of things. And it was all predicated on economic outputs, that investing time and resources into these human beings will turn them into active economic agents who will make an economic contribution to the community. So it was all about economic regeneration of the area, and that is actually what happened. Obviously, that fund is no longer accessible from anyone, I don't think, but certainly not from the UK. But I think that's been part of the game of trying to understand where do the resources lie. HE is one of those places where resources still do exist in some way. And I'm sure that's why HE is a site for understanding how the work is developed. But I'm going to move on. Lucas, do you have a question? Yeah. Right.
Hi, this is Rosie Perkins, Royal College of Music. Thank you so much for these insights, and also the similar session yesterday. I've taken a lot from it. And I wanted to pick up, Tim, on your point about sort of flexible and multiple identities in institutions, and just draw a thread with Bridie's talk yesterday, where we were reminded of structure and cultures within conservatoires. So there are various sort of structural parameters in which this teaching and learning is happening. So I'm thinking of things like assessments where performance students still have very individualistic sort of solo recitals that take huge chunks of the credits that they're able to get. So what I'd love to ask the panel is for your reflections on what sort of structural changes you think need to happen in conservatoires to enable us to educate socially engaged musicians.
And I'm going to chip in as well from, there's another question that's very similar to that, Rosie, so I'm hoping that it's okay. Pam Bernard has asked online as well, a question directed to Tim, but others may like to chip in as well. What might a radically enacted conservatoires policy change be motivated to reposition the social at the heart of music making? What would that look like? So it's similar line of questioning. Tim, you might want to answer first on that.
Roll up those sleeves, Tim.
Yes, thanks, Pam and Rosie. I think that involves quite a lot of sort of chats around a pint or whatever. I would start by saying there's massive structural changes that are not even in the conservatoire, but in the context within which the conservatoire sits. There's the expectations of those who come to it. There's the expectations of their parents and those who pay for it, which in the UK is actually with the government, and we're under significant pressure in arts education because students are not paying back their student loans because they don't earn enough over the courses of their careers. There's the expectations of a lot of the kinds of staff that we employ, and the expectations of the industry industries to provide them with suitably trained people for their specific niches. And that's let alone within the kind of formal HE structures, which are rather behaviorist in terms of the ways that you create documentation and you describe modules. You know, we have learning outcomes against which we have to assess, and we have criteria which have to represent the learning outcomes. And you know, if you design a module program, you end up in this behaviorist sinkhole, where eventually in a validation meeting you just have to say, look, these people have an amazing time, and we teach them through sharing and through sending them out to do stuff, and curriculum as process, which the whole HE framework of documentation doesn't recognise at the moment in the UK. So before we go, even into what does the training look like, we have to think about the context in which it's situated, and that's incredibly complicated. And we have to be really brave as institutions to say, yeah, we can manage all that, and this is what we want to do. And the trouble is that we are kept in a position, this is from a UK background, and my institution is not the wealthiest. It's no secret that we're one of the ones that financially struggles because we don't have sort of independent backers or great legacies or so on. We're kept on a kind of leash of adhering to things like that Office for Students guidance about how to get your specialist funding. And it's extremely hard to move away from that, let alone that we want to attract the students, and so we continue the narratives. Actually, we're a great socially engaged institution. It's just that's not necessarily how we have to show ourselves in our formal identity. So what would it look like? Well, we need to rethink musicianship. We need to rethink, actually, it's no point in producing people who can whiz around according to the dots if they have no conception of what the dots represent, if they have no conception of how to develop their ears, if they have no conception of how to improvise, how to fold other people into their music making. That might be one preferred choice for one student to go on into that kind of very specific career, but it's a massive risk for them. But for the others, we need to show what musicianship might really mean. And that means pulling the rug out from under their feet of their last 15 years of training, because it's almost certainly been done in those kind of ways. There we go. This is a long conversation.
And I can see both Bridie and Lucas have their hands up. So I wonder, Bridie, maybe could you take your point first? Oh, sorry.
Thanks so much to the panel. Like many in the room, having worked in a conservatoire environment for many years, there's so much I relate to. And I've been sitting here with so many questions, trying to decide which one to ask. I wanted to pick up on your point, Jess, when you talked about nurturing socially engaged people as well as musicians. And I wanted to ask the panel about their thoughts about how we do that. We recently did some research looking into the social curiosities of our Conservatoire students, and it was really quite telling. Some were socially engaged, and others said, I've come to a Conservatoire to learn my instrument. I don't care about climate change, and I'm certainly not interested in using my musical skills to address the refugee crisis, whatever. And that was quite shocking. And I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the role that we can play in terms of engaging our students to think in social ways, to enact their ideas in social ways, and to really spark that curiosity in them to become socially engaged people as well as musicians, and the role that we can play in that process. I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts about that.
I can try. So the first word I wrote down is mirror. So I feel the space that I create is hopefully something I'm mirroring forward to them or out, and comes back in that they recognize or maybe become familiar with a sense of, oh, I'm part of a community. This room is a community, and we're going to notice each other and what's happening in that space. So I think, in a way, creating a little microcosm of a way of being in the space we create together is kind of at the core of it. It's slow. And I think that we have this urgency. There is, I feel, an urgency sometimes that there's an outcome, that we have to show what they've done, but actually slowing it down and asking questions and saying, oh, what did you notice in what just happened? And if nobody says anything, actually sitting in the silence for a second, because actually people notice more than they think they notice if they're given the time to contemplate a little bit. And I think sometimes we're in such a go mode that the time, learning to reflect is actually partially digestion and time taking, isn't it? And sometimes we're in too fast processes. Our processes are too fast. I'll speak in full sentences. And so a lot of it is about just creating that environment. And for me, a lot of that is about the unprogrammed time in between, which somebody else commented on, I believe earlier or yesterday, around, between an activity, between a doing, it's a being together, and allowing the space to become socially engaged with one another. And hopefully that then, we're turned inward, but hopefully we slowly turn outward as people go out on placements and notice. I ask them to look for specific things on placements. And then again, they're being asked to notice. And for me, it's about teaching the capacity to notice, in a way. Big question.
It is a big question. I mean, we have a tiny little bit of time to work with students, to work with people. A minuscule fraction of their life development. So we can't really turn everybody into socially engaged people. But I think what we can do, coming back to Jess's point, is we can create the safe space, for want of a better word, where the students can have freedom to express themselves and to disagree with each other and to agree with each other and learn from each other about that. I mean, one of the things I've really noticed is that the musical activities we do give permission for the students to actually make quite deep disclosures about themselves. And we create a situation where those difficult conversations, which could be about anything to do with social engagement, can take place, really. And I think it's also important that we are, as lecturers, whatever we're called, we're allowed to have our own opinions. And I think we're not just there, come back to Freire, we're not just there filling people with knowledge. And I don't think it's right for me as an ageing white man to hold the agenda, but I think it's correct for me as an ageing white man to open up the space for the people of difference in the room to control that agenda, and through having their own agenda to develop their own social engagement, to develop their own opinions and their own differences. Sorry, it's just garbled.
I wasn't garbled at all. I was really, really eloquent. I was thinking, Brady, for me, it's when the encounter, when the student appreciates that the encounter has an impact on their own musicianship. So it's my favourite story in this regard is like one of the students that taught at Royal College of Music taking their clarinet along to an old people's home on a visit, and somebody going, "Oh, what's in the box?" So they got their clarinet out and started playing. And when they did, they said, "I just started randomly playing like an Elvis song because I knew it." And this old guy in the front just like completely just changed and started tearing up, and everybody kind of gathered round him, and I could see that it meant something to him. And so in that moment, and I just locked eyes with him. Absolutely locked eyes with him. And in that moment, I really knew that it meant something important to him. And I played, and the expression that I was playing with just felt really, heightened more than I was ever capable of doing before. And I found out afterwards that he'd been recently bereaved, and that's why he'd only just recently moved into the home. I didn't know any of that, but it just made me really think, oh wow, that's what music can do. So now when I'm performing in the orchestra, I'm thinking much more about that. I'm thinking about how is this music reaching people. So it's when that encounter, when people can see this isn't just a benefit for the people it's intended for, but it's benefiting me, and it's benefiting the things that I really care about.
Dave, there are two people over here who had their hands up for quite some time.
Great.
Anne and then Sean.
Great.
Sorry. I'm sorry, Bridie, it's a really good question because
Okay.
it's a really good question because all four of us want to answer it. So institutions are not neutral in this. By our very ways of being, we promote particular narratives of what music is and how it works in the social settings. So we have to also mirror social responsibility. So two examples from Trinity-Laban. A couple of years ago, we had a year-long festival called Venus Blazing, where all college concerts had music by women at least 50% of time in those concerts, against significant opposition from some of our staff. And we're just starting a new one called Don't Stop the Carnival, where all college concerts for 1 year have music at least half of all time by composers who are not white. We have to represent what the social engagement impact or missions or challenges that we think our students have. It's the institution's responsibility.
You can see the problem. We've got too much to say between even this dialogue. So let's maybe the next questions. Let's see if we can not answer all four of us. Yes, question at the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to take on the point which was called...
Can you introduce yourself as well?
Oh, yes, sorry. I'm Natalia Ardila Mantilla. I come from the School of Music and Dance in Cologne in Germany. And I was thinking about this tension between like musical expertise, which when you have like a core musical home, and this wide aspect of to have a wide musicianship, which enables you to act in a wide range of places. And I was thinking about that different institutions mirror the different pathways of musical expertise which people can have. So in conservatoires, we have these people who are like really interested in having a specialization. They come with a really high kind of motivation to take music, and in other institutions they might be another kind of another kind of people. But when they come together in the field, in the best case, they are able to work with each other and to develop different practices which mirror different approaches. And the reason why I'm thinking about that is because I was very attracted of the idea you have been putting, Tim, about reframing musicianships, because the problem in conservatoires is this interest in music is immediately translated in this culture of perfectionism you were talking about at the beginning, which wouldn't be necessary. It would be possible to have an idea of musicianship which is relational, which is situated, which is social, even if you are on the core, I don't know, a clarinetist or whatever. That doesn't imply you have to be exclusive. So I would like, I think the role of conservatoires is something we should think about, how we use this expertise and this kind of specialization programs we have, but frame it in a relational and a social context where even people who are working in Western classical music have a conscience of in which kind of environment they're working in and how can they cooperate in collaborative environments to create more meaningful musical experiences.
Great, thanks for that. Was there a question in there as well? No, that's great. Thank you. Thanks. Let's go over here. Anne maybe has a question.
Actually, I wanted to answer Bridie's question about how you can help students to become socially engaged. In my opinion, there's one step before what Tess just said. I think a lot of, maybe I have to say, I teach participatory music at the Conservatoire in Ghent in the educational master. So, and my experience is that a lot of the students, they are really not aware of all the social organizations which are in the neighborhood. So the first step is, I think, before you can reflect, you need something to reflect on. So for me, the first step is confrontation. Just take the students to these places so that they can feel what it is to be poor, feel what it is to be a refugee. So it's this really an engagement starting from being there in that context. I think that's the first step. And of course, you cannot be sure that students will be socially engaged, but this is the first step, I think. That's something I wanted to contribute to you. And then I had one question, because I'm teaching participatory music in the teacher education, actually. So everyone who becomes a teacher at our conservatoire, they have to do part of their practical training, and it's really like half-half. Part of their practical training is in formal music education, and the other half is in participatory music. Because we think that by doing this, they learn a lot about how to deal with diverse groups, as well about different methodologies of working. They have to change their ideas about how you teach music completely, actually. For example, if you work in a prison, you cannot do something with scores, you have to work differently. So this is why this is in teacher education. So I wanted to ask you, where would you position these courses? If you can make a community music course at an institution, would you position it as a different type of musicianship, or as well in teacher education, or what would be the ideal? That's my question.
Great question, Anne. Thank you. And actually, I wonder whether. Do you want to hear specifically from us, or is that a good place to? It feels like, actually, if we're starting to get questions and responses within the room, that maybe Anne's question is something that we might all take up. Actually, what does it? Because that's a great question. What does it actually look like? A course that is broader, that encompasses the totality of what music might be. For me, it's about thinking about music in a holistic sense of all of the things that music can do in the world as a starting place, and then actually thinking about course design from there. But maybe is that a good place to open this up for smaller group discussions? How would people feel about that? I'm feeling in the room that there's a lot to say on this subject.
The problem with smaller, I'm sorry. The problem with smaller group discussions is that the people who are following online will not be able to follow it. So I don't think that's a good idea.
Of course.
Sure. Say something to that question?
Yes.
We also have a long question from Phil Miller. Oh my goodness, it's 7 lines. I just wanted to say, when I was kind of tasked with creating a module that isn't community music or music education or one-to-one tuition, I was really hit with this thing, okay, well, what's at the core? And for me, good practice is good practice. And the skills that I try to offer could be embedded into a music classroom. They could be embedded into a community practice, because most of it is around relationship. And so we have a very different curriculum in Scotland. So when people have talked about the UK up until now, they are not including Scotland, just to be clear. So our curriculum is much more holistic. Well, I can't compare it to England, but we have called the Curriculum for Excellence. So we work with a whole set of outcomes and experiences that could easily be transitioned into a community setting. So it's very easy for me to actually put curricular outcomes and experiences onto my community projects, and vice versa. So I think it's just, for me, it's around the core of our practice for the most part. And just around the kind of model of expertise. And something you said, Tim, around placements being in a place that is very unfamiliar. we have a pop cohort and a classical cohort, which are completely separate until they come into the BA year. I fight against this all the time, but I fight against the separation. So they come together, and all, particularly our kind of brass and reed players, they're going out into a project, a lot of them called Brass Blast, which is with an organization called Oi Musica. And they come back like somebody's just, I don't know, hit them with 7 cups of caffeine. They're so excited. I had to improv. I had to play without notes. Oh my God. And it's just their excitement and their ear training that grows out of that. And we have an obligation to ensure these experiences. And this rich, diverse musicality isn't only genres, it's something, I don't know, it's this the excitement of the otherness of exploring it. Sorry, that was not short. I apologize. Sean had a question, or there's 2 over here.
Go on, Sean.
I'll try and be brief. Just thank you all so much to say and think about. I think riffing off this question a bit, it's to do with what is it in the course. I guess my question provocation is, what is it that every student in a conservatoire needs to engage with and needs to experience and connect with as part of their training? And I suppose I'm then pushing it into not only in terms of what is it that we do within our curriculum, what Tim was saying so clearly, that journey. As someone else said, where curriculum gets assessed and justified to within an inch of its life, which is what's happening across the piece. And then we're referencing what happens outside that, what happens within. If we're thinking about our strategies, core strategies, what is our purpose? What are we here to do? What do we want every student to think about and then go out with, whether they are classical, popular, community-based, whatever? I think, I'm not saying this isn't happening already, but there's something fundamental in that question. It's down to the people. It's the human element of what we do and why we do it. And I think if we just transferred 10%, let alone 100% of what you're all talking about and what a lot of everyone in this room is doing in terms of their courses, into the sensibility, the mindset, the culture of our organisations, then that becomes a game changer and actually quite transformative in terms of what we do, why we're doing it, and what that brings to our society now and into the future.
I think some of this relates to Pam's question earlier, which is what might this all look like from a conservative point of view? And so I'm talking about a very specific subset of what's going on. That's what I can talk about. I think one of the abstracts, I forget whose it was, says it's very clear that some students walk away from this saying, this is not for me. This is not how my musicianship was going to work out. And it's going to work out in different ways, and that's absolutely fine. And so it might be that we need to expose students to the potential of this work without saying this is what you have to do. This is the outcome. I think go back to the point which I think is nascent for me, but that I made. It's the social impact of music. It starts from the very sound, the first sounds that we make. If music is a relational practice, then the sounds we make are social, and that means that I think we need to encourage every student to unpick the relational in their sounds and what that means in terms of gender and what that means in terms of race and of power and of class and of representation. And that if a student can do that and can say, that's fine, I'm happy existing in a kind of violent, white, male-oriented European industry, then that's what I choose. But I understand the relational impacts of what I'm making. And then you can say, great, go ahead and do that. But there has to be an understanding that the very first sound that anybody makes is a form of communication, and that we are saying things. And at the heart of it, that might mean that you need to unpick your skills, and that if you're working in an old people's home, then you need to be able to improvise and be able to hear and harmonize and have a kind of great ear. And that's a kind of essential relational skill. But that I would say that putting the relational at the heart of what we do, even in the very elite Western art music framework, is going to be the kind of burner underneath it all. That's where I go.
Can I share with you what Phil's comment? Phil's actually left some wise words rather than a question. So I'll share Phil's words with you, and then I think we've probably got time for maybe one or two more questions. But actually, the questions maybe now for this final part, if we can be thinking of questions that we can ask that don't necessarily need to be answered by the panel, but could be questions that you'd like answers to or thoughts on, and then anybody might want to answer. But Phil says in relation to this topic. And I'm not going to do the accent. I think in any development programme for socially engaged music, the participants could share their lived experiences, their music, and their own ways of approaching socially engaged practice. But this depends on who is in the room and how empowered they feel to really explore the important things. Many people would not enter a university, never mind a conservatoire. So unless much work is done, for example, we had a paid worker at Goldsmiths to develop engagement with local communities and musicians and help them feel the college was a place for them. The voices heard will be restricted to narrow parts of society. Also, their course leaders need to have a set of values that prioritises what the people being and that prioritises what the people bring and not cultures imposed by the university system. That's going to be much cited, I think. Thank you, Phil. I think we have a question here, and then Dan here.
This is a question for everyone. How do we assess in a way that corresponds with the values and the pedagogies that you have been discussing, and we are so invigorated by your conversation? Because for me, I feel like a hypocrite every time I have to assess at the end of the course, because it's counter to what I believe in, and yet it's an institutional obligation, and it's a pathway to graduate studies and scholarships, et cetera, et cetera. We live in a system that I don't think facilitates this kind of thinking in higher education, and I would love all your thoughts because I'm struggling with it.
Great. So any responses to that question? For me, an answer to that question starts with the notion that quality, however we think of quality, is always contingent. So in terms of making any kind of assessment of anything musical, it completely depends on the situation, and when the situation is different, then we need to think differently about what we're assessing.
Assessment starts as dialogue, and then it moves on, and I think that has to be the starting point. Otherwise, it's violent.
At the back. Lucas. A comment at the back. Can't see who that is.
Hello, my name is Miriam James. I work at the Guildhall, leading on music education in Islington. Just with the assessment, I think if you see it as kind of accountability, Toby said if this money could be spent elsewhere, why should be spent it on this project? I think turn it around as a positive thing. How can you make the best, get your project kind of informed, the best of possibly kind of useful to you for doing it again, and not just saying pleasing the people who funded or so, see it as a side product. Because I do think we sometimes come to a point where we just spend someone else's money because we think it's good, but whether the other side really gets something out of it, and whether it's the participants, whether it's the musicians, is yesterday we spoke at kind of widening the whole understanding of the network of impact, a whole community, parents, teachers, schools. That's something we need to learn about. They're not just self-fulfilling projects we do so that we feel better. So I think kind of turning our understanding of what it is, using it as an advantage to our projects, that helps me at least.
Great. I think we may have time for one more. Oh, we've got two questions down here. Imogen, let's see if we can squeeze two questions in.
I'll talk fast. I'm Imogen Flower, also from the Guildhall. This is kind of a question around the tensions of being a practitioner educator, I think. I think a lot of people in this room will be balancing those kind of identities. I'm interested in the duty of care and education towards students and the reliance on placements and practical experience within those educational programs or environments, and your duty of care towards community members as well, and the kind of need to be cultivating independence, freedom to make mistakes sometimes, but also avoiding this situation of, like Jess said, winging it. Is it good enough? Is it good enough for the people who these students are essentially practicing on? That's my kind of question.
Do we want to
each respond to that? This is one of the things I contend with the most. So I don't ask my students to lead. I don't feel it's fair to them. They're not at that stage. But remember, I have one module in third year. So perhaps if it were a first year, a second year, and a third year, by third year, they like your students design and deliver, but that's kind of comes later. After, They're postgrads. So I mean, I have some students who their lived experience is really small. Like it wouldn't be fair on them, nor on participants. And I think for me, this kind of trickle down of duty of care is a huge issue. I have 37 students to place in a very small country, in a very small town. I mean, Edinburgh's 400,000 people. It's like minuscule, right? So it becomes really challenging on that front, and then monitoring all of that. But there's so much to learn without being in charge in that moment. And then we treat our classroom like the participatory laboratory. So they try things out on each other where permission has been granted, and then they can assist on a workshop if they want, and go forward. But I don't force it, because I think the duty of care lies perhaps with children who, to children who haven't agreed because the school's agreed. But actually, the children haven't agreed, or the parents haven't necessarily agreed. So we have to be really careful. So there is a constant tension. And I don't know if there's an answer, because we also have to get dirty as practitioners to get better. So, there's a whole series on YouTube about this.
And for me, it comes back to the point that I made right at the start, that in terms of this practice, when it's best, when it's most effective, is situated learning. And what that means is the way that people learn to do it effectively is through legitimate peripheral participation. They need to be immersed in communities of practice. They need to encounter the practice. They need to sit alongside somebody more experienced and over time feel confident about taking that leap into leading a part of the activity, rather than being thrown into it and sink or swim. How are we doing for? We've got 2 minutes. I want to. Yes.
Just to say what Dave said at the very beginning about how, at least for me and for you, and we didn't come through the training route that allowed for that time, right? So we all got dirty probably the harder way. So I think that is what's happening now, is that there is training. I mean, that's the bottom line. We can allow that trickle up, that slow burn that a lot of us just didn't have the luxury of. So I'm sorry to past participants, but here I am.
We've got 60 seconds, Tina, but I'd love to hear the question.
It's thanks to my teacher, Anne, that I'm sitting here, and I'm very passionate about my work as a musician in the grassroots. But what I was thinking, I'm doing this work mostly as a volunteer, and I think if you want to motivate students to go in this field, you also need to create jobs in this field. So we can think about the training and becoming a specialist in it, but I want to really passionately do this job and get money for it also, because I also need to pay my bills. So now I'm doing it as a volunteer, and I squeeze it in my time I have. But yeah, I also think that there should be appreciation for this work, and that in care homes and asylum centers, there should be a possibility to work as a musician. So I think we should broaden it and also think about societal barriers that would make it open for us.
Thanks, Tina. We are going to have to. It is 1 o'clock, so I want to try and keep us to time and not eat into our lunch. So can I thank everyone for your questions and comments? Can you please show your appreciation for the panel? And we'd very much like to thank Lucas and everybody involved in SIMM for the opportunity to present our dialogue and to have this dialogue with you as well. So thank you.